She was a thing left by the tracks, a piece of luggage someone had decided was too heavy to carry any farther. The wind, which never seemed to sleep in this part of the country, took liberties with the thin fabric of her dress, pressing it against her bones until she looked like a carving of hunger. Her shoes were gone. The raw, red dust of the platform had worked its way into the cracks of her bare feet, a second skin of shame. A sign above her head read promise, a cruel joke written in peeling black paint. This was the end of the line, the place where promises came to die. She had been brought here on the morning train by a man with a soft voice and hard eyes, a man named Elias Thorne. He had spoken of a schoolhouse of children eager for letters and sums. He had not spoken of this post, or the length of rope that now chafed her wrists. He had tied her there not with anger, but with the weary indifference of a man discarding a tool that had failed to perform its function. The townspeople of Promise drifted past like tumbleweeds. Some stared, their eyes lingering on her face, on the tear in her sleeve, on her bare feet. Their gazes were heavy, adding another layer of dust to her skin. A woman in a severe bonnet muttered something to her companion, who clucked her tongue. A pair of boys, young and cruel as new knives, threw a pebble that landed near her feet. It made a soft puff in the dirt. She didn't flinch. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the place where the brassy sky met the bruised purple land. She had learned to make herself small inside, to retreat to a quiet, empty room in her mind where the wind and the stares and the gnawing in her belly could not reach. She was not a teacher. She was not a woman. She was a post. She was the dust. She was the waiting. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of blood orange and sorrow. The crowd thinned. The novelty wore off. She was just another piece of the bleak landscape. Soon, the station agent would come out, cut her loose and tell her to move on. Move on to where? The wind seemed to howl. Where? That was when she saw him. He had been there for some time, leaning against the far wall of the mercantile, half hidden in the long shadows of the afternoon. He was a tall man, thin as a fence rail, folded into himself as if to take up less space in the world. He wore a dusty brown coat that had seen too many seasons and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't staring at her, not like the others. He was observing, the way a hawk observes a field, taking in everything at once. The post, the rope, the indifferent sky, the last of the gawkers slinking away. For a long time he just stood there. Silence stretched thin between them, a fragile thread across the dusty expanse. The station agent finally emerged, a man with a tired slump to his shoulders. He looked at her, then at the man in the shadows and sighed. It was the sigh of a man who had seen too many kinds of trouble and wanted no part in any of them. Then the shadowed man moved. He pushed himself off the wall with a slow, deliberate motion. Each step he took across the open ground seemed measured, heavy. He didn't look at her until he was standing a few feet away. His eyes, when he finally lifted his head, were the color of a winter sky, and they held whole winters in their depths. They held a grief so old it had become a part of the landscape of his face. He didn't speak to her. He addressed the station agent, his voice low and raspy, like it came from under floorboards. "I'll take her." The agent blinked. "What's that, Caleb?" "I said I'll take her," the man repeated. His gaze didn't waver. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact, like declaring the sun had set. Elias Thorne, who had been drinking in the saloon and had emerged to see what had become of his discarded property, laughed. It was a sound like stones rattling in a dry gourd. "Take her? She's worth less than the rope that's holding her. She's broken." Caleb's eyes shifted to Thorne. It was a slow, cold movement. He said nothing. He simply looked. And in that look, there was a stillness that was more menacing than any threat. Thorne's laughter faltered, then died in his throat. He shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable under that flat, empty gaze. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He untied it and shook 3 silver coins into his palm. They shone dully in the fading light, He tossed them onto the station agent's desk. They landed with a soft, definitive clink. It wasn't a purchase. It was the settling of a debt she had never incurred. He turned back to her. He pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt. The blade caught the last of the sun. She flinched, a small, involuntary tightening of her muscles. It was the first movement she had made in hours. He saw it. He paused, holding the knife still. He took a half step back, creating more space between them. He wasn't a threat. He was an ending. With 2 quick, clean slices, he cut the ropes. They fell away from her wrists, leaving angry red welts behind. She rubbed her wrists, the feeling of blood returning a sharp, prickling pain. She didn't look at him. She looked at her feet, at the ground that was now, terrifyingly, hers to stand on. "Come on," he said, his voice still that low rumble. He turned and started walking toward a wagon hitched near the mercantile. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He assumed she would. After a long moment, a moment that felt like a year, she took a single shaky step, then another, and she followed him into the deepening twilight. The journey was a silent one. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the soft clopping of the horses' hooves, and the sigh of the wind as it swept across the high plains. The man, Caleb, sat straight-backed on the driver's seat. She sat in the back, huddled in a coarse wool blanket he had tossed to her without a word as the chill of the evening began to bite. The blanket smelled of dust and wood smoke and something else, something faintly floral, like dried lavender. A ghost of a scent. He drove the horse at a steady, unhurried pace. The land grew emptier, the last vestiges of the town giving way to a vast, open country of rock and sagebrush. The stars began to appear, cold and sharp in the ink-black sky. They looked like chips of ice. Once, he stopped the wagon and reached back, offering her a canteen. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused. She drank, the water tasting of metal and mercy. It was the first act of kindness she had known in months, and it almost broke her. She handed the canteen back, her hands trembling slightly. He took it, his gaze lingering on her for a fraction of a second before he turned back to the horse. They arrived hours later. The homestead was little more than a dark shape against the paler dark of the plains. A small, sturdy-looking house made of sod and weathered timber, a barn, and a few corrals. It was a place that had been carved out of the wilderness by sheer force of will. It looked lonely. It looked like him. He led the horse into the barn, unhitched the wagon, and tended to the animal with quiet efficiency. She stood by the door, wrapped in the blanket, feeling like a stray dog not sure if it would be welcomed or kicked. He finally emerged from the barn, carrying a lantern. The golden light pushed back the darkness, creating a small circle of safety. It threw his shadow long and distorted against the wall of the house. "In here," he said, gesturing to the front door. The house was one room. It was clean but stark. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and dark. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cot in one corner, and a closed door leading off to what she assumed was another room. The air was still, holding the memory of a life that was no longer there. He crossed to the fireplace and began to build a fire. He worked with the same economy of motion he did everything else. Soon, a small flame flickered, then caught, and a welcome warmth began to seep into the room. He pointed toward the closed door. "That's your room. The bed is made," he then pointed to his own cot. "I sleep here," he looked at the front door. "I don't lock it." It wasn't a speech. It was a map to a new, fragile kind of safety, a room of her own, a man who slept on the other side of the main room, an unlocked door that was an offer of freedom, not a threat of intrusion. This was the unspoken contract. She nodded, a small, bird-like dip of her head. It was the most she could manage. She clutched the blanket tighter and slipped through the doorway he had indicated. The room was small, containing only a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt and a small, empty washstand. There was a single window looking out onto the immense, dark land. The room felt vacant, like it was holding its breath, waiting. She sat on the edge of the bed, the quilt soft beneath her fingers. For the first time in a very long time, she was in a room with a closed door, and she was not afraid of who might be on the other side. She didn't sleep. She listened to the sound of the man moving in the other room, the crackle of the fire, and the howl of the wind, which sounded a little less like a threat now, and a little more like a song. The days that followed fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. They were a study in shared silence. They worked in parallel, two solitary figures moving through the vastness of the homestead. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. She would hear the soft scrape of the door, and when she emerged from her room, he would already be out with the horse or mending a fence line that seemed to stretch into eternity. There would be a pot of coffee on the back of the stove and a slab of dry bread on the table. She began to claim her own space within the routine. First, it was small things. She swept the floor, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a quiet answer to the chop of his axe. She washed the 2 plates, the 2 mugs, the 2 forks, and set them back on the shelf. She found a sewing kit in a dusty box and mended the tear in her dress, her stitches small and neat. She mended a hole in his coat, using a piece of cloth from an old shirt she found. He never mentioned it, but the next morning, he left a bar of soap and a slightly less threadbare towel by the washbasin for her. Section she explored the edges of the property. Behind the house, on a small rise overlooking the endless plains, there were 2 graves. 2 simple wooden crosses, weathered by the sun and wind. One was larger, the other heartbreakingly small. Engraved on the larger one were the names Sarah and Daniel. The carving was rough, done by an unsteady hand. His wife, his son. One afternoon, she found a patch of stubborn wildflowers growing near the well. She picked a few, their purple heads bright against the dun-colored landscape. She walked to the rise and placed 1 flower on each grave, a small, silent acknowledgement of the ghosts that lived in the house with them. When he came in for his supper that evening, he stopped in the doorway. He looked at her, his gaze holding an unreadable emotion. He had seen the flowers. He said nothing, but the quality of the silence between them changed. It was no longer just an absence of words. It was something shared. He began leaving more than just bread for her. A bowl of watery stew, piece of dried meat. She, in turn, began to cook. She found a small bag of flour and some dried beans. Her first attempt at bread was a disaster, a small, hard rock that could have broken a tooth. He ate a piece without complaint. She tried again. This time, the loaf rose. It was still dense, but it was bread. When she set it on the table between them, he looked at it, then at her. A corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "This one didn't die in vain," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's a little dry," she whispered. It was the first full sentence she had spoken to him. "You didn't complain about mine," he countered. The silence that followed was comfortable, almost warm. They were stitching their lives together, 1 meal, 1 chore, 1 shared silence at a time. The nights were the hardest. The dark held memories that the light kept at bay. One night, a scream tore through the silence of the house. It was her own. She sat bolt upright in her bed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The shadows in the corner of the room twisted into the shape of Elias Thorne, his hard eyes glinting. The door to the main room creaked open. Caleb stood there, a silhouette against the dying glow of the fire. He didn't come in. He just stood in the doorway. "Don't lock me in," she gasped, the words tumbling out, raw and terrified. "Please." He stood there for a long time, his presence a steady, solid anchor in the terrifying dark. "I told you," he said, his voice soft. "I don't lock doors." He stayed there until her breathing evened out, until the terror receded, leaving only an exhausted ache behind. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He offered his presence. It was more than enough. The next evening, as they sat by the fire, she found the courage to ask the question that had been sitting in her heart for weeks. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the flames. Why did you take me? He stared into the fire for a long time, the light playing across the harsh lines of his face. He looked old. He looked like a man who had been carved from grief. The town needed a teacher once, he began, his voice low and far away. My wife, Sarah, she thought so. We had a boy, Daniel. He was 6. He would have been your first student. He fell silent, but she didn't rush him. She waited. The fever took them both in the same week, he said, his voice flat, stripped of all emotion. It was a bad winter. After that, the town didn't seem to need a teacher anymore. He finally looked at her, and his winter eyes were filled with a desolation so vast it stole her breath. When I saw you tied to that post, a teacher, thrown away, felt wrong, like letting the last candle go out. He looked back at the fire. This land takes things. Took my wife. Took my son. It shouldn't have taken you, too. She finally understood. He hadn't rescued her out of pity or charity. He had done it as an act of defiance against the harsh, unforgiving world that had taken everything from him. In saving her, he was protecting a memory. He was honoring a ghost. She reached out, her hand hovering in the space between them for a moment before she rested it, very gently, on his arm. He didn't pull away. He simply sat there, and for the first time they weren't just two people sharing a space. They were two solitudes touching. The first sign of trouble was a plume of dust on the horizon, a smudge against the clean, blue sky. It was too deliberate for cattle, too slow for a storm. It was riders. Caleb saw it from the fence line he was repairing. He went still, his hand frozen on the post. He watched the dust cloud for a long minute, his face hardening into a mask of stone. He dropped his tools, turned, and walked back to the house with long, purposeful strides. She was hanging laundry on a line she had strung between the house and a cottonwood tree. She saw the look on his face, and the warmth of the sun on her skin suddenly felt cold. Go inside, he said. It wasn't a suggestion. She didn't argue. She gathered the damp sheets in her arms and went into the house, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She watched from the window as he went into the barn. He emerged a moment later, not with the old horse, but with a rifle in his hands. He didn't hold it like a threat. He held it with a grim familiarity, resting it in the crook of his arm. He stood in front of the house, a solitary figure waiting for the past to arrive. It took nearly an hour for the riders to reach them. There were 3 of them. The man in the lead was Elias Thorne. He looked different out here, away from the town. The swagger he wore like a coat in promise looked cheap and out of place against the vastness of the land. He looked small. He reined in his horse a few yards from where Caleb stood, his lips curling into a sneer. Well, playing house, are we? Thorne's gaze flickered to the laundry line, to the smoke curling from the chimney. I've come for my property, Caleb. She's not your property, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. The rifle stayed in the crook of his arm, pointing at the ground. I have a contract, Thorne blustered, patting a pocket in his coat. A contract for a bride. Paid her passage all the way from the east. She belongs to me. You threw her away, Caleb stated, the words flat and hard as river stones. Left her tied to a post. Your claim ended there. That was a lesson, Thorne spat, for her insolence. Now her lesson is over. I'm taking her back. We have an agreement. From inside the house, she watched, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. The old fear was a cold knot in her stomach. The urge to hide, to retreat into that small, empty room in her mind, was overwhelming. But then she looked at Caleb, standing his ground, a lone man against 3. He was defending more than just her. He was defending this fragile piece they had built, this house that was slowly learning to breathe again. Thorne began to dismount. I'm not asking. As Thorne's boot touched the ground, the front door of the house opened. She stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the glare. She was no longer wearing the ragged dress she had arrived in. She wore a simple, mended frock she had found, and her feet were bare against the packed earth of her own accord. She looked from Thorn to Caleb. Thorn's face broke into a triumphant grin. There she is. Come along now. We're leaving. She took a step forward, and then another until she was standing beside Caleb. She didn't look afraid. She looked tired of being afraid. She looked directly at Elias Thorn, her eyes clear and steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried in the still air. It was a voice he had never heard before. "My name," she said, each word a carefully placed stone, "is Lena." Thorn stared, his mouth slightly agape. It wasn't the defiance he had expected. It was something quieter and far more powerful. It was a claiming of self. Caleb's gaze flickered to her for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something that looked like pride. He shifted his weight, and the rifle in his arm seemed to become heavier, more significant. "You heard her," Caleb said, his voice still low. "Her name is Lena, and this is her home. You'll leave now." One of Thorn's men shifted nervously on his horse. This wasn't the easy retrieval they had been promised. There was something in the air now, something unyielding. "This is not over," Thorn snarled, his face red with fury and humiliation. He had been dismissed. Not fought, not overpowered, but simply dismissed. It was an insult he couldn't stomach. He climbed back onto his horse, his movements jerky and angry. He pointed a finger at Caleb. "This land will burn, old man. I promise you that." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men scrambling to follow. They were a cloud of angry dust, shrinking back into the horizon from whence they came. Lena and Caleb stood there for a long time, watching them go. The threat still hung in the air, sharp and ugly. But they had faced it, together. She was trembling, the aftermath of courage shaking her body. She didn't realize she was crying until Caleb's rough thumb gently brushed a tear from her cheek. It was the first time he had touched her with such tenderness. "I was scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, his voice rumbling softly. He finally let the rifle rest against the wall of the house. "You didn't run." "No," she said, looking up at him. "I didn't run." The silence that fell between them now was different again. It was the silence of a battlefield after the victory, the silence of a shared breath, the silence of a beginning. The house stood behind them, solid and real. It was no longer his house. It was theirs. Thorn's threat was not an empty one. A week later, they woke to the smell of smoke, thick and acrid on the night air. The horizon was on fire. The dry grass of the southern pasture was burning, the flames eating their way toward the barn. There was no panic. Caleb was out of his cot in an instant, pulling on his boots. "The well," he said to Lena, his voice sharp with urgency. "Get buckets." "Vet 6. Anything." She didn't hesitate. She was already moving, her fear a cold, sharp tool that gave her speed and clarity. They worked in the hellish glow of the fire, a frantic, desperate team. He dug a firebreak with a spade, his movements powerful and rhythmic, the muscles in his back cording with effort. She hauled bucket after bucket of water, her arms screaming with the strain, her lungs burning with smoke. They beat at the edge of the flames with wet burlap sacks, the heat scorching their faces, the smoke blinding them. They fought the fire for hours, two small figures against a raging beast. They fought for the barn, for the horse, for the house, for the 2 graves on the hill. They fought for every silent breakfast, for every mended shirt, for every shared look across the dinner table. They were not just fighting a fire. They were fighting for the life they had built from the ashes of their pasts. As the sun began to rise, a pale, sickly yellow through the haze, the fire began to die. It reached the firebreak Caleb had dug and sputtered out. Defeated, exhausted, covered in soot and sweat, they collapsed onto the scorched earth. The barn was safe. The house was safe. They had won. Later that day, as they surveyed the black, smoking ruin of the pasture, a wagon appeared on the road. It was the station agent, and with him were 2 other men from the town. They carried shovels and sacks of seed. The agent, a man named Miller, tipped his hat. "Heard you had some trouble," he said, looking at the blackened field. "Thorne was in town yesterday, bragging. We figured we'd come help with the replanting." Caleb stared at them, his face unreadable. "We ain't all like him, Caleb," Miller said quietly, his gaze falling on Lena. "Some of us remember what a good woman your Sarah was. And we seen you're building something good out here again." He looked directly at Lena. "Welcome to Promise, ma'am. The real 1 inch." They worked all day, the 4 of them, turning over the burnt soil, planting new seed. The town that had once watched her with scorn was now helping her put down roots. That evening, after the men had left, Caleb and Lena sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the smoky sky. The air smelled of burnt grass and new earth. He turned to her, his winter eyes clear in the soft light. "I need a wife," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you deserve a name, a home, a life that no one can take from you." It wasn't the wild proposal of a stranger. It was a statement of truth, earned in fire and silence. She looked at him, at this quiet, broken man who had carried her from the edge of oblivion. She saw the graves on the hill, not as a sign of what he had lost, but of how much he was capable of loving. "And you need sons," she said softly, not as a promise of children, but as an acknowledgement of the hole in his life she now knew she wanted to help fill. It was an echo of a ghost, remade into a vow for the future. "Lena," he said, trying out her name. It sounded right in the quiet air. "Caleb," she answered. He reached out and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, hers was small and soot-stained. Their fingers intertwined. It was a promise made without a contract, a bond forged in a crucible of loss and resilience. They didn't need a church or a preacher. They had the land as their witness. They had rebuilt a burned fence, a symbolic act that felt more binding than any words. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. That night, she didn't go to her small room. She stayed in the main room, spreading her blanket near the hearth. He laid his own cot on the other side. They slept in the same room, separated by the gentle, breathing light of the fire, 2 islands that had finally found their archipelago. The house was no longer hollow. It was full of the quiet hum of 2 people stitching a life together with raw thread. It breathed again, a slow, steady rhythm of hope in the vast, silent heart of the plains. This story, it ain't just about rescue. It's about naming. It's about the moment someone looks past the thing you've been made into, the discard, the failure, the ghost, and sees the person waiting underneath. We all get tied to a post sometimes by circumstance or by cruelty. We're left for the wind to pick at, for the world to pass judgment on. And the greatest act of defiance, the truest act of rebellion, is to find the voice to speak your own name, to declare, to the whole empty sky, "My name is," so here's your naming. It's not about finding a protector, not really. It's about finding the one person brave enough to stand in the silence with you. The one who offers you a canteen of water, a warm blanket, not because they want to own you, but because they recognize your thirst, because they know the cold. And if you're brave, if you're willing to fight a few fires and plant seeds in scorched earth, you might just find that the silence stops being empty. It fills up. It becomes a language all its own. It becomes the sound of a home,